And this is a very toxic plant, which you might recognize, the Audrey Jr. I don't know if any of you have it in your backyards. I'm still looking for one myself. What you'll see in the presentation, I thought that they were at the very end of the presentation, are too many references for you to use. Now, one of the problems, as you're going to see, if you look at these references, and I hope that you will, is that they're overly inclusive. What you're going to find is that things like apples and apricots are on the list of poisonous substances. And this is going to relate to an issue we'll get into about risk and hazard. And the point being that in terms of hazard, which is a measure of the seriousness of a poisoning, both apples and apricots show a high hazard level. They contain cyanide, which is a lethal poison. But in terms of so that's the hazard. In terms of risk, the likelihood that you'll suffer a bad effect from eating an apple, it's extraordinarily low. I've seen one estimate that you would need to eat a cupful of apple seeds, and you would need to carefully chew them up so that you broke the brown covering on the seeds before you could possibly experience an adverse consequence. So we're going to be talking about risk and hazard, and toxicity is sort of a combination of these two factors. And I'm not sure that we are starting at the beginning of the talk. We may be going backwards. But we'll find out in just a moment. Okay, this is good. This is good. I think we're in good shape. So these are the kinds of questions that were in your little mini quiz. And we can skip them because you've already answered them. If you believe that someone has been poisoned, call poison control, and this is their phone number. Do not call the helpline. I know that you are all skilled in helpline advice, but if you think that you have been poisoned or your neighbor or your neighbor's child, you want to call poison control, get a photograph of the plant that you think was responsible, or bring, if it's safe, bring leaves or other material that you can use for identification along with you if they tell you to go to an ER. Yes, ma'am?
I was just going to add that if at all possible, bring a piece of it. So, like mushrooms, for example, if you take a picture of a mushroom and help you identify it, you have to take that mushroom and turn it upside down with little pieces off it to identify it. You can't just take a mushroom. You have to say, like, hey, this mushroom, 2 hours ago, you cured of it. So, like, pictures don't.
Okay, there you go. The voice of experience. So I already began talking a little about this, assessing risk. And risk is a function of the likelihood of exposure. So if with apple seeds, very small risk. If we have a poisonous plant, but the poison is at the flowers at the top of the tree, again, relatively small risk compared to a poisonous piece of plant like a rhubarb leaf, which is very, very close to the ground. Additionally, risk is going to relate to who the person is or the animal is who is the possible subject for toddlers. We worry about their getting into things that are close to the ground, like mushrooms, which aren't plants, but they have high frequencies of toxicity. One of the real dilemmas is that the concentration of the active toxic material in a plant is not something that we can quantify for all members of that species. The amount of toxic material in a plant is going to vary depending upon the age of the plant, the particular species of the plant, the culture conditions, how much sun and water the plant gets, how healthy it is. So it's very difficult, unfortunately, to order plants by their level of toxicity. It's going to vary. And I've already mentioned this point, as well as this one. Okay, so hazard is a function of risk of exposure and the severity of the adverse effect, and also the sensitivity of the individual. Many of my slides are going to have the word desert in them, and that's because I live in the desert in Palm Springs, and I generally teach out there. But many don't be concerned by the word desert. Many of these plants obviously are up here, and beyond that, we should be focusing somewhat on drought-tolerant species anyway. So before you pick up a piece of fire stick over here, which is sort of a passive-aggressive move on your part, Dave. I'm a little surprised. So before you pick that up, know that euphorbias, and the fire stick cactus in particular, is #1 on my list. When we first moved to the desert, we bought a fire stick because, as you'll see, the new growth is really attractive. Bright orange or red, it's very nice. And it's drought tolerant, what's not to like? And we planted it next to our mailbox. We discovered, and we really do like our postman, we discovered that fire stick grows incredibly quickly, so it needs to be trimmed frequently. And as you've heard, and as you probably already know, the sap, the white sap in the euphorbias is highly toxic. It contains a lot of latex, and it will destroy, damage skin severely. And if you transfer the sap unknowingly from your fingers to your eye, you can lose your sight. It damages epithelial tissue. So euphorbia is #1 on my list, and it goes by a variety of names: pencil cactus, pencil tree, sticks of fire. It's in every big box store, and there are no warnings about its toxicity, or danger, I should say. Oleander is #2. And it's interesting that oleander now is not permitted in Norco, a good move to follow. Both the shrub and the Japanese oleander, the tree, are toxic materials. Foxglove or digitalis. Castor bean or ricin. You may not have ever seen a ricin or castor bean plant. They're very unusual and very cool looking, but the ricin, which comes from the seeds, is one of the most toxic materials in nature. And microgram quantities of the powder can be lethal. Did you have a question?
Yeah, we have them in bathing here. I have 20 of them in my backyard. Here in Riverside, it's a really big phenomenon.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
I've been showing them over.
I've only seen I've only seen one ricin plant in the desert, and it was, huh?
Van Buren.
Okay.
Van Buren, between Mockingbird Canyon, and there's like a transformer station on the side.
Uh-huh.
There's a big open field.
Okay.
And I guess nobody's cutting it down, so like you can get a code enforcement case for letting it happen.
not only invasive, more important to me, it's highly toxic, the seeds. But it's a very cool looking plant, and whatever. Plants with thorns, spikes, and teeth. I used to start out the lecture, and I sort of forgot to do it this time. I usually start off by saying, I'm not really focusing directly and entirely on toxic plants. There are multiple, I'm focusing on dangerous plants, and there's a big difference. Toxicity entails sort of a biochemical response to a substance that's in the plant, the way it interacts with tissue in your body. And I'm including mechanical injury, I'm including inflammation and allergy as other instances of danger. Well, most of the exposures that we get that are dangerous are either mechanical injury to our skin, aka fooling around with cactus, and ingestion. And we, as adults, we typically don't eat very many plants on a random basis. Children might, pets do. But there are other forms of toxicity that you need to be aware of. One of them is inhalation as a route of exposure. And there have been instances where people have burned oleander, and the smoke from the oleander fire carries with it toxic material, which can be inflammatory to lungs. Pollen also is carried by the wind, and for people who have allergies, this is another way in which you can get exposed to a dangerous material. There's also a possibility for interactions between toxic materials in plants and exposure to sun. You know, another example that you're maybe more familiar with on a pharmacologic level is the interaction between sun exposure and certain antibiotics. If you're on antibiotic therapy, very often you're told, stay out of the sunshine. So, back to the apple story. Does an apple a day bring the toxicologist business? And again, there's no way around this. There's no way that you can look at any of the references for toxicity, including the one that's produced by this fine organization. I mean, all of them will list plants that we routinely eat and enjoy on a routine basis. So you need to use your brain a bit and try to figure out what is truly a risk and what is not a risk. Another thing that's very interesting about toxicants, as you know from the quiz, is that not all parts of a plant are toxic. Rhubarb leaves are highly toxic. Rhubarb stems are highly delicious. And maybe one of you or more of you got to enjoy a rhubarb pie yesterday on Pie Day. Again, apples, the seeds versus the fruit. And risk is not the same for all individuals. People who are occupationally exposed to things, gardeners who expose themselves to things are more at risk than the normal general population. Similarly, children and pets may be more vulnerable. Those subject to allergies are more vulnerable to allergens. But who is not vulnerable? Who is not equally vulnerable to toxic materials? Turns out that rodents are pretty resistant. Who knew? Yeah, bummer. One of the ways, so if one of the major routes of exposure to toxicants is by ingestion, most species will either eliminate the material by throwing up, by vomiting, or through GI irritation and diarrhea. Both of them effective ways of passing, getting rid of a lot of the dose. Rodents don't have a vomit response. And so they've evolved this really clever behavior. What they do when confronted with a novel possible food is they'll consume a small amount of it and then wait and see what happens. And if they get sick, they will never ever go back to that material. It's called one trial learning, avoidance conditioning. Some of you, I know I have, some of you may have gotten sick after eating something in your lifetime or drinking something in your lifetime. And yeah, for me it's scotch, and from when I was in college. And just the smell now triggers this response. Well, that's what it's like being a rat. They don't go back. And so that makes it difficult to poison rats. So these are the dangers that we think of with dangerous plants. Physical injury, AKA from cactuses, allergies, inflammation, such as by the sticks of fire, and the last one is true toxicity, and there's a branch of pharmacology called pharmacognosy. And pharmacognosy is the science that focuses on plants as medicines. Well, the notion that plants can be toxic is sort of the dark side of pharmacognosy. Toxic effects generally are species specific, but susceptibility can vary among individuals. Some general principles. The severity of effect is related to dose and route of exposure. The severity of the effect is related to the amount of exposure, the duration of exposure, and in the case of allergens, the frequency of exposure. And for toxicants, the dose is usually expressed as units, such as grams per unit of body weight. And this is why children and pets may be more vulnerable to certain materials. They're more likely to eat these things, and their body weight is far lower than ours, so they're getting a much higher dose per pound of body weight. So physical injury, the most straightforward danger. Common in the desert, it affects everybody. And going, before I forget, I meant to mention before with fire sticks, that when you prune them, which you have to do all the time, it's really important to pick up the pieces that drop on the ground, because if a pet wanders by, it can get the sap on its paws. So anyhow, physical injury affects everybody, susceptibility greatest among osin. Examples of bad actors, cacti, roses, which are not toxic in terms of edibility. Is that a word? But they're obviously dangerous. Bougainvillea, pyracantha, cholla cactus, most of these should be somewhere there's a light on this thing, but I don't know where it is. Agave Victoria Regina over here on the bottom, a Opuntia up there on the top right-hand side, and a mix of barrels and other pole cacti on the top left. Some roses in the top, obvious. And it's a very funny thing with the parallax. It's very hard to actually look at. Well, there's Bougainvillea on the left, and pyracantha over there. Thank you. So additional aspects of getting stabbed by these thorns is that they may inject bacteria into the skin. They open up a wound that can be filled by some other toxic material or bacteria. They can also mobilize the body's own defense mechanisms. So if you don't pull the thorns out, the body's going to respond. If the thorn is stuck in there, it may work to surround the damaged material, and you may wind up with sort of a hard lump where there used to be a thorn, and that may be permanent. And we all acquire enough lumps and bumps as we age. We really don't need to add any more to that. Okay, so some home remedies for getting rid of thorns. I suspect that you've all picked your fave. I usually use fine forceps. Others, sometimes I'll use duct tape. I've never used the third one, the Elmer's glue and tape. What you do supposedly is you let the Elmer's glue dry on your hand or the affected material, and once it's dry, you pull it off with tape. Wearing good gloves is an awfully good way to avoid being injured by all these nasty, thorny materials that we work with. Okay, inflammation. The susceptibility is widespread, but the degree of susceptibility varies by individual. It may be due to a chemical effect that's augmented by mechanical injury. So again, if you injure your hand with a stab by a cactus, and then you're exposed to fire stick, you may get a more severe effect. Chemical irritants are toxic materials that are in parts of the plant, maybe the sap. The sap of the fire stick has actually been used to make poison arrow tips. Interesting. I've heard stories of people who have transferred the sap from their hand to their eye and have intense pain, and if they're smart, get to an ER immediately to avoid blindness. It's really nothing to fool around with. When I used to trim the fire stick, before I got rid of it altogether, I would wear goggles, and I would use a long 10-foot pole, with tree trimmer, and dump the broken branches into the garbage right away. So you really need to take serious steps to avoid exposure. Succulent euphorbias with white latex sap can produce contact dermatitis. I generally use white sap as a clue that I may be dealing with something dangerous. Now that's being overly cautious, because I have a wonderful black mission fig tree, and it also has white sap. I think the answer is that it's not just the white sap, it's the chemical components of the white sap. The succulent euphorbias, including not only the fire sticks, but also poinsettias are bad guys. Fig trees have white sap. I find that when I'm picking figs, that my hands get really itchy, and I'm not really sure whether that's due to the sap, which is kind of sticky, or to the combination of that plus the fact that the leaves have these little hairs on them. But it doesn't stop me from enjoying my figs. Yes? I don't think so. I guess when I'm thinking of a dandelion, yeah, the stem is kind of pale, but I'm not. Really? Huh. I've never. Yeah, sure I did that. No, no, never, ever. Huh, huh, yeah. I still never did it. Okay. But you used to do it and you're okay. Okay, so I guess, I would guess it's not so bad. If you did that with fire sticks, you'd have trouble. Okay, so here are some nasty euphorbias. More nasty euphorbias. And these are very common. The crown of thorns, for example, on the top left. I don't know the common names for any of the other guys, but you see them, again, in every big box store, in every nursery.
Why is that? I mean, if they're that poisonous, wouldn't you think people would be, choking and falling down all over the place? I mean,
Well, I guess that, people, there probably are a fair number of injuries from fire sticks. But again, it's contact dermatitis. It's going to be damage to the skin, which is not pretty, and I'll show you a couple of pictures. Otherwise, I think that the thorns keep people away on some of these, like the crown of thorns. So the injury can be extended to other organs if you eat some of this stuff. I don't know why you would want to eat a fire stick. It would be very painful, very, very painful. Here you go. Here are some nasty pictures, I promise, of contact dermatitis. These welts and reddening, it's a massive response of the immune system to injury. So examples of irritant agents beyond the fire sticks: old man cactus, Dieffenbachia. Some agaves have high levels of calcium oxalate. Rhubarb has oxalic acid in the leaves in high concentrations. Root radishes and horseradish have thiocyanates, and that may be what gives them their hot, spicy flavor. And that's what I forgot to bring. I was going to bring a really delicious, nasty chili plant here and offer it to anybody who wanted it. I mean, these chilies are so, so hot and painful. But I forgot. And anyhow, another example of a dangerous plant. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a little story to share too.
Okay.
Today I made roasted poblano chilies, and I stuffed them with,
And where's ours?
my husband liked them.
Oh.
I should have worn gloves because my hands burnt so bad all evening, and I kept washing with soap and water, and then I took my contact lens out there.
Ooh.
The next morning I tried to put it back in, it was like, wow. I had to throw it out. Yeah. So now I'm gloves.
Yeah. Good.
Soak your hands in milk.
Soak your hands in milk. Wear gloves. Wear gloves. Yes.
I'm going tomorrow morning to throw out black fire stick, basically. That's what I learned tonight. So if something happens and I do get something on my hands, I mean, despite all best efforts, is milk the best thing?
Wear gloves.
Well, I will.
Don't go near it. Use if you're going to dig it up, use a nice long shovel and drop it into your trash bin, and do not get it on you. And wear gloves, and wear, just in case, wear gloves, wear goggles if you have them. Can you speak up a little bit?
I said use
Yeah.
That way you don't have to touch it.
That will then be spots with other plants, like I don't flower it.
Ah, yes.
California seems to regulate everything under the sun. Why are there no regulations against plants like this in big box stores?
Well, why in a regulating state such as California are there not warnings for these things? Well, what plant do you see planted along every highway in the state? Oleander.
But the sharpshooters removed them.
Ah, yeah, right. Okay, that's true. In any case, it is what it is. Buyer beware. I don't have an explanation.
Last thing, having gloves on. Wash your gloves afterwards. Use Dawn soap. Don't use glove detergent, use Dawn soap. Because it gets the latex off, otherwise your gloves, next time you go to put them on, you're just gonna get on your hands again.
Okay, good. I'm glad to be here because I'm learning some really practical things. So wash your tools, wash your gloves after you deal with these nasty materials. Okay, I'm sort of beating this into the ground, but so these are the reasons. These are the reasons why this is the reason every big box store sells Fire Stick. It sells. It's popular. And here are the good reasons why it's so popular. Allergies, you're all probably familiar, either have them yourself or knows someone who does. And it's a hit and miss. So allergy problems occur by breathing pollen. Sometimes they're from getting exposure on your skin to, let's say, oils on a plant. Sometimes your dog may run through a field of poison oak and get the oil all over his or her skin, and then you and because it doesn't get to its skin, there's no response. But when you pet your dog, there you go.
You can't burn it either.
And sorry?
You can't burn poison ivy or either.
Yeah, it's not a good idea to burn poison oak or poison ivy. Okay, finally, toxicity. This is the meat and potatoes. Species specific, but they generally affect all individuals within a species. Sensitivity of individuals may vary. Pets and small kids are especially vulnerable because of the body weight issue, and also they're more likely to expose themselves to stuff. Here's an example that I think is really interesting. Milkweed is toxic to most organisms other than monarch butterflies who feed on it. And it's so interesting that monarch butterflies themselves are toxic to birds when the birds eat them. And so birds generally learn not to eat monarch butterflies. So toxicity of plants, a pattern of injury is likely to be organ system specific. The basis for the injury is due to a biological activity of the toxic material. In addition to plants, molds, and as we've heard, mushrooms, which are not truly plants, can be toxic and produce severe liver damage. Oh yeah, and one of the potent molds is aflatoxin, which grows on things like peanuts. And so there are federal standards for how much aflatoxin can be found in peanut butter. So, targets for toxic plants. Well, the GI system is very common because, after all, that's how we expose ourselves to a lot of toxics, through ingestion. And examples are California buckthorn, a plant that I don't know at all, wisteria seeds, castor beans, and the autumn crocus. I've listed a bunch of organ systems and the types of materials that damage them. Cardiovascular system is very vulnerable. The brain and central nervous system are very vulnerable. And you're going to see that these organ systems in particular come up frequently with the same plant material. So for example, oleander or digitalis, oleander can affect both cardiovascular system and the brain or the nervous system. There are other examples like that, and you'll see them going through. Angel's trumpet we haven't mentioned. I have a photograph of it a little bit later on in the. Sorry? There is a pattern here. There is a pattern here. How many people are missing from this class?
I've heard that you actually have to boil part of the angel trumpet to extract the toxin. So if the flowers fall on the ground, if your dog eats it, nothing's going to happen.
I'm not so sure, and I don't want to do that experiment.
I don't want to either, but we have a huge one in our yard, and it's gorgeous.
I see. I would do some serious research. I mean, I've never seen an angel's trumpet in the desert, so I'm not really familiar. I know what they are. I've seen them elsewhere. So I don't really focus on them, but I would do some research on it and determine what part of the plant is toxic and whether or not you lose the toxicity when the flower falls. They have a great smell, and they're beautiful. Yeah, but don't eat them.
No.
Yeah. Nicotinia, which we haven't talked about, is also a very common annual and contains nicotine and it has cardiovascular and central nervous system effects.
Is that all
I think mainly the flowers. So here are some common toxic plants that you may recognize. What's the bottom one? The bottom one is one we haven't talked about yet, and that's a Florus kalanchoe, or I think it is. I know that the Florus kalanchoe is of that. I don't remember why I took that picture. But that would be a good. Nicotinia is number 2. Yeah. Duranta has become really, really popular in the desert recently. It's a very small tree, has these really beautiful flowers, and it's quite toxic to a variety of species. And curiously, the desert area gardeners have a list of 50 plants that you should really have in your garden, and they still have Duranta on that list despite my protests. So, Duranta, it probably does, but I don't know it. Here's angel's trumpet at the top in 2 different colors, oleander on the right. And I'm not sure where the slide is. One of the things that's interesting with oleander also is that there are these apocryphal stories, which may or may not be true, of Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts or Marines using oleander branches to cook marshmallows or hot dogs. Choose, which one, and everyone dies or everyone gets sick. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's really not a smart idea to use oleander stems to cook, to make s'mores, Here's on the bottom you see the leaves and the flowers of the castor bean. And is that cool or what? I mean, it's a terrific looking plant. But even as a toxicologist, I won't have it in my yard. Angel's trumpet contains belladonna, which is the bad one. There's another example, speaking of extractions, castor beans and castor oil. Castor oil isn't toxic. how did they get away with that? Well, that came up in the class, in the desert class, I think last year, and I looked it up, and I don't remember the answer. But the answer was either that in the process of heating the beans to extract the oil, you get rid of the toxicity. And I think that's the correct answer. The other possibility was that they extract the castor oil using solvents, and that process results in loss of toxicity. Yes, ma'am.
But interesting enough, castor oil is used in constipation.
As a purge.
To reduce diarrhea.
Exactly.
Which is what would happen if you ingested.
Yeah, exactly. It's a weaker version of what happens if you eat the beans. So anyhow, but interesting fact. So there's a buckthorn. I don't know that I've ever seen one. So there are a couple of slides that I'm still looking for, and I'm hoping they're in here somewhere. So preventing toxicity, gloves, good ventilation, using moisturizers to protect your skin, and removal of material by washing up after. You really need to wash your hands when you come in after gardening. I'm sorry. You really do need to wash your hands when you come in after you garden. And I'm really bummed that this one slide somehow is not here. Foxtail seeds. Foxtail seeds. And I gave this lecture about a month or so ago in the desert, and someone brought me a photograph of a poor puppy who was out in a field where there were foxtail seeds. And foxtail seeds, I mean, foxtail is sort of a wild grass. It looks sort of attractive, but the seeds have a very specific shape. They're pointed at the end, and they sort of move their way inward. And they can go into an animal's eye or into its skin or into its mouth or nose and travel from those sites to remote organs. And the picture that I had was of this poor little puppy, I think named Hot Dog. And Hot Dog had gotten exposed to, we believe, one of these foxtail seeds somehow, and it wound up lodging in his chest wall. So you would think, okay, well, he's running through the field, he gets the seed, it goes through his skin and it settles in his chest wall. No, there was no evidence of a lesion on the skin. So it traveled somehow, either by... Yeah, well, it can do that. It can, the exposure can be through the paws. It can be through the nose, the eyes, the fur. You get on the fur, the ears. So if you're in an area where there is foxtail, you need to really check your pooch after he or she comes back in and get rid of these things. I was amazed. I was stunned when I saw this. And I guess I've learned subsequently that we have foxtails at least as close as Banning. So that's dangerously close to Palm Springs. Sorry?
I planted some beautiful purple fountain grass in our yard last year,
Uh-huh.
and then my dog was trying to break the bank, she's constantly going to the vet. She's just kept sneezing and sneezing and sneezing, well, and she loves to go around and sniff everything. She agreed that it's kind of shaped like a foxtail.
Huh.
It was up in her sinuses, and we had to go to the vet, and they had to,
Expensive.
yeah.
Yeah, I guess that I started looking at decorative grasses in my neighborhood, and I had pretty much convinced myself that the shape of the seeds was quite different from the foxtail seed. But something to be cautious about. And it's an unusual example of a mechanical injury that can happen in the lung or in the heart or basically any organ. So that's amazing to me. And this poor guy somehow ran into a foxtail seed. And there it is after it was extracted by the vet. And because you have to see gory pictures. There it is. There's the incision. There's the incision. So yeah, so he's happy now. His owner is out, who gobs of money. Just a lesson.
How did they know?
How do they know? Well, they're presuming that a foxtail seed. It's obviously a seed of some sort. There it is, after it was extracted.
No, that's what I mean, how did they know there was a reason to do something?
Okay, the animal had a lump, was bothering it, scratching at it, irritated by it, and they thought it might be a cyst or whatever, and they did some initial investigation. They decided that there was something internally, and so they did surgery. Apparently, and I've had other people in class say, yeah, you're looking at $1,000, multi-$1,000 vet bills, so be careful.